The lights in the grand hall were too bright, and the air was too thick with perfume from 100 worlds, when Caliph Vorthessa pointed one long silver finger at the human delegation and said the words that would change everything. "I'll wed any human who can defeat me." She laughed after she said it, a short, sharp laugh, the kind you give when you already know the answer. I did not laugh. My name is Daniel Hartley, and until that night, nobody in that room had any reason to know my name at all. I was not a general. I was not a scientist. I was a logistics officer who got pulled into the Concorde induction ceremony because someone senior got sick, and I was the only one who fit into the spare uniform. I was standing near the back, holding a glass of something orange and fizzy that I had not dared to drink, watching the most important night in human history happen to other people. The Thren delegation stood across the hall like a wall of muscle wrapped in ceremonial silver cloth. They were tall, taller than any human, with skin like polished stone and eyes that caught the light strangely, like they were lit from somewhere inside. Caliph stood at the front of them, and she was the tallest of all. I had read the briefing packet on the shuttle ride over. Every delegate had. The Thren were a warrior culture, we were told. Combat was their language of respect. They did not go to war for land or resources anymore. They had grown past that centuries ago. But they still settled disputes, still measured character, still even proposed marriage, through ritual combat. Caliph Vorthessa, the briefing said, was 211 years old by Thren reckoning, undefeated in every challenge she had ever issued, and she had issued this same challenge to 17 other species since the Concorde began contacting worlds outside her home system. 17 species, 17 polite refusals, or 17 quick defeats. Never once had she lost. She was not doing it because she wanted a husband. Everyone in that room understood that. She was doing it because it was theater. It was a performance she gave to new members of the Concorde, a way of saying, without saying it directly, "You are new here, and you are small." The ambassador from Earth, a calm, older woman named Helen Brackwood, gave a diplomatic smile and a diplomatic laugh, the kind trained into people who spend their lives in rooms like this. Around her, our delegation laughed too. Nervous laughter, polite laughter, the kind of laughter you give when you don't know what else to do with your hands. I did not laugh. I don't know exactly why. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count since then, and I still don't have a clean answer. Maybe it was because I had spent 4 years in a support unit during the border skirmishes back home, watching quiet people get overlooked right up until the moment they mattered most. Maybe it was because something about the way Caliph said those words did not sound like theater to me. It sounded tired underneath the confidence, like a person who has told the same joke so many times that she has forgotten it used to be funny. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just don't like being laughed at, even when the laughter is aimed at everyone and no one all at once. I set my drink down on a passing tray. I said, "Name the time." The words came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. The hall went quiet, in a way that a room full of 100 different species should not have been able to manage all at once. I felt every eye in the building turn toward me, human and otherwise. I felt Ambassador Brackwood's gaze land on the side of my face like a physical weight. Caliph Vorthessa's smile did not disappear right away, it just stopped moving, like a picture someone had paused. For 200 years, nobody had answered her. She tilted her head, studying me the way you might study a small animal that has just done something unexpected, something that does not fit the shape you had already decided it belonged in. "You," she said. Not a question, just a word, testing the air. "Me," I said. Somewhere behind me, I heard Ambassador Brackwood say my name under her breath, low and urgent, the way you say a name when you are trying to call someone back from the edge of something. I did not turn around. Caliph crossed the space between us in a handful of steps. Up close, she was even taller than she looked from across the room, and there was a faint humming sound that came off her skin. Something I would later learn was a kind of low-level energy field all Thren warriors carried, like a held breath made physical. Her eyes, up close, were not cold. That surprised me. I had expected cold. What I found instead was something sharper and more complicated. Curiosity, maybe even hunger, though not the kind you'd think. "Do you understand what you have just done?" she asked. Her voice was pitched low, meant only for me, though I suspected half the room could still hear it. "I understand you asked a question," I said, and I answered it. "This is not a game, small one." I didn't say it was. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger, something closer to surprise, quickly buried, like she had caught herself feeling it and did not want anyone to see. 17 species, she said, quiet enough now that it felt like she was speaking to herself as much as to me. 17 delegations, generals, champions, warriors, bred for combat since birth. None of them said yes so quickly. None of them said yes at all in the end. "I'm not a general," I said, "and I'm not a warrior." "Then why?" I didn't have a full answer for her yet, not one I could put into words in that moment, standing in a hall full of watching eyes, with my ambassador's hand now gripping my arm hard enough to bruise. So I gave her the only honest thing I had. "Because you didn't expect anyone to say yes," I said, "and I think that bothers you more than you want it to." For just a second, something cracked in her expression. Just a second. Then it was gone, sealed back behind 200 years of practiced composure. She straightened to her full height and turned to address the room, her voice rising back into the theatrical register she'd used before, the performance snapping back into place like a mask. "Then it is decided," she announced. "The human has accepted my challenge. 3 days from now, in the arena of the Concord Council, we will meet." The room erupted into noise. 100 different reactions from 100 different species, some delighted, some alarmed, some already placing wagers if their body language was any indication. Ambassador Brackwood pulled me aside the moment Calith turned away, her fingers digging into my arm, her voice a furious whisper. "Do you have any idea what you have just done to this delegation? I said yes to a challenge. You have made us a spectacle. Do you understand what happens to a species that gets humiliated in front of the entire Concord in its first month of membership? Do you understand what happens to trade agreements, to defense treaties, to how seriously anyone takes us for the next 50 years, when our representative gets flattened in an arena by a woman who could probably break you in half without trying?" I looked past her shoulder, toward where Calith stood surrounded by her own people, already being congratulated, already being toasted, the joke already spreading through the hall like wildfire. But I noticed something the rest of the room seemed to miss. She was not laughing anymore. She had not laughed since the moment I answered her. And once or twice, when she thought no one else was watching, her gaze drifted back across the room to find me, and there was nothing amused in it at all. There was something that looked almost like hope, quickly hidden, the way you hide something you're afraid to admit you're feeling, in case it gets taken away from you the second anyone notices. Ambassador Brackwood was still talking, still building towards some kind of order for me to withdraw, to apologize, to find some diplomatic way out of what I had just started. I heard maybe half of it. My mind was somewhere else, already turning over the shape of the problem in front of me, the way I used to turn over supply chain failures back in the service, looking for the gap nobody else had noticed yet. 3 days. I had 3 days to figure out how a man who had never won a real fight in his life was going to stand in an arena against an undefeated warrior twice his height and somehow walk out of it without losing everything my species had just started to build. I did not know the answer yet. I only knew one thing for certain, standing there in that too bright hall with 100 worlds watching and my ambassador's voice rising in panic beside me. I was not going to walk back my answer. Whatever came next, I had already decided that much. The gala continued around us, the orchestra restarting somewhere near the far wall, conversation slowly filling the silence I had created, but underneath the noise, I could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. Something had shifted in that room that went beyond a simple bet or a diplomatic embarrassment. 200 years of the same joke, told to species after species, had just met someone who refused to laugh. And somewhere in the crowd, hidden behind 2 centuries of armor she had built around herself out of victories that never meant anything, Calith Vorthessa was already wondering, for the first time since anyone could remember, whether she might finally lose. I finished my drink. I did not remember picking it back up. 3 days. I had work to do. I did not sleep that night. I lay on the narrow bunk in the human quarters of the Concorde station, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of a ventilation system built by engineers from 3 different planets, and I asked myself the same question over and over. Why had I said yes? I want to tell you it was courage. It would make a better story if it was courage. But the truth is smaller and stranger than that, and if I am going to tell you this story at all, I should tell it honestly. I grew up in a house where nobody ever noticed me first. I had an older brother who filled every room he walked into, loud and easy and liked by everyone within 5 minutes of meeting him. I was the quiet one, the one teachers forgot to call on, the one who sat in the back of every class picture. I did not resent my brother for it. I loved him, but I learned early that being the quiet one meant people made decisions about you before you ever got a chance to speak for yourself. When the border conflict started, back when I was 23, my brother enlisted in the frontline units, the ones that got the recruitment posters and the parades. I enlisted in logistics, because someone had to keep the supply lines running, and because nobody else wanted the job. For 4 years I watched convoys move through dangerous corridors, watched loud, confident officers make loud, confident decisions that got people killed, and watched quiet sergeants and quiet privates fix the damage afterward without ever getting their names mentioned in a single report. There was a woman in my unit, a supply coordinator named Grace Whitfield, who taught me something I never forgot. She used to say that the ones who swing first are usually swinging because they're afraid of what happens if they wait. The ones who wait are usually the ones who actually understand the fight. I thought about Grace a lot, that first night after the gala. I thought about how Calith had made that joke 100 times to 100 different species, and how every single time someone had swung first, in one direction or another. Some had puffed up their chests and accepted, only to be beaten in seconds. Some had laughed along and backed away, protecting their pride by pretending it was never a real question. Nobody had simply agreed, quietly, and meant it. I kept coming back to the look on her face in that one unguarded second after I answered her. It was not the look of a woman enjoying her favorite trick. It was the look of someone who has asked the same question so many times, expecting nothing, that she has forgotten what it feels like to hope for something else. I did not know yet whether that meant anything, but it was enough to keep me from calling Ambassador Brackwood in the morning and telling her I had changed my mind. She called me instead. I was summoned to a private briefing room 3 hours after sunrise, station time, where Ambassador Brackwood was waiting with 2 Concorde liaison officers and an expression that told me this conversation was not going to be pleasant. She did not waste time on formalities. "You will withdraw," she said. "I have already begun drafting the language. We will frame it as a cultural misunderstanding. We will say the human representative did not fully grasp the weight of the challenge, and that Earth requests the option to formally decline without dishonor." "That's not what happened," I said. "I am aware of what happened, Mr. Hartley. I was standing next to you. I am telling you what is going to happen next, which is that you are going to let me fix this before it becomes a permanent stain on our species' first year in the Concorde." One of the liaison officers, a thin, nervous man named Peter Aldridge, slid a datapad across the table toward me. On it was a recording of Calith's last recorded challenge match against a champion from a heavily armored species called the Voss. The entire match lasted 11 seconds. The Voss champion, a creature nearly 9 feet tall with natural plating across his chest and arms, hit the ground and did not get back up until the medical team arrived. "This is what you are agreeing to stand against," Peter said. 11 seconds, Mr. Hartley. That was their best fighter, bred for combat since birth. You are a logistics officer. I watched the recording twice, not to convince myself to back out, but because something about it bothered me, and I needed to understand what. "She didn't want to win that one," I said finally. Ambassador Brackwood frowned. "Excuse me?" "Watch her face." "Not his, hers." I turned the pad so they could all see it, and replayed the final 2 seconds before the Voss champion went down. She's not enjoying it. She looks almost bored before he even hits the ground, like she already knew how it would end before it started. "That is not the point," Ambassador Brackwood said. "The point is that whether or not she enjoys it, she has never lost, and there is no version of this match where you defeat her physically. If you go into that arena, you will be hurt, possibly seriously, and our species will be remembered for exactly the kind of foolishness the Concord expects from new members. I am ordering you, as your ambassador, to withdraw." I sat quietly for a moment, turning the datapad over in my hands. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "In all the briefing material about the Thren, has anyone actually read the full ritual rules? Not the summary, the actual original rules of the challenge." Peter Aldridge shifted in his seat. "There's a summary in the cultural briefing packet. Combat to first decisive result, judged by a neutral elder. It's a few pages." "I didn't ask about the summary," I said. "I asked if anyone has read the original." Nobody answered right away, which was its own kind of answer. "The original text," Ambassador Brackwood said slowly, "is several thousand years old, written in a version of the Thren language that predates their modern legal system. It has been summarized and updated for outside diplomatic use precisely because nobody outside the Thren needs to parse ancient scripture to understand a modern combat challenge." "I'd like access to it anyway," I said. "The full original text, not the summary." "Why?" "Because everyone who has fought her fought the summary," I said. "Maybe it's worth understanding what the summary left out." Ambassador Brackwood studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that measures whether someone in front of you has finally lost their mind or has just said something worth listening to. I could not tell, at the time, which way she had decided, but she nodded, finally, and told Peter Aldridge to request the full historical archive from the Thren Cultural Office, under the reasoning that Earth's representative wished to demonstrate respect for the tradition before the match. It took most of that first day for the request to be processed and translated. While I waited, I did something else. I asked to meet with any Concord diplomat who had personally witnessed one of Calith's previous challenges, not through recordings, but in person. There were 3 still on the station. 2 declined to speak with me, polite, but clearly uninterested in involving themselves further in what they viewed as an embarrassing spectacle. The 3rd agreed, a small, quick-witted diplomat from a species called the Marn, whose name translated roughly to Sella in the human alphabet. Sella met me in the station's observation deck, a quiet, glass-walled room looking out over the slow turn of the nearest planet below. "You are the human," she said, before I even introduced myself. Her voice carried a dry amusement that reminded me a little of Grace Whitfield. "The one who said yes. That's me. Everyone is talking about you. Some think you are very brave. Some think you are very foolish. I have not decided which yet." "I'm not sure I've decided either," I admitted. "I was hoping you could tell me something." "You've seen her fight, in person, more than once?" "3 times, Sella said. "Once against a Voss champion, once against a member of my own delegation. Many years ago, a fool who thought a challenge from a warrior woman was an insult, to answer with mockery, and once against a creature from a species I will not name, because they no longer wish to be reminded of it." "What did you notice?" "Not about the fighting, about her." Sella tilted her head, the Marn equivalent of surprise, I would later learn. "That is not a question anyone has asked me before. I'm asking now." She considered it for a long moment, watching the planet turn slowly below us. "She fights the way someone performs a ceremony they no longer believe in," she said finally. "Efficient, practiced, empty. I have watched 200 years of victories that mean nothing to her, human. I do not think she wants to defeat you. I think she wants, very badly, for someone to make her feel something while she does it. But that is only an old diplomat's guess, and old diplomats guess wrong more often than we like to admit." I thanked her and left with more questions than I had arrived with, but also, For the first time, something like the beginning of a plan. That evening, the translated archive arrived, delivered by a nervous Concord translator who apologized twice for how long the process had taken, and once more for how strange the language was to render into standard. I sat alone in my quarters with the full document, several hundred pages of dense, formal, ancient Thren law, and I began to read. Most of it was exactly what the summary had promised. Rules about the arena, rules about neutral judges, rules about what weapons or abilities were permitted or forbidden. I read for hours, my eyes aching, finding nothing that changed anything. Then, near the end, buried in a section the modern summary had compressed into a single sentence about how victory was determined, I found something that made me sit up straight in my chair and read the same paragraph 4 times to be certain I understood it correctly. The ancient rules did not define a decisive result the way the modern summary implied. The modern summary said, the match ended when one combatant could no longer continue. The original text said something different, something older, something almost forgotten. It said the match ended the moment one combatant made a choice the other did not expect and could not answer within the boundaries of the ritual itself. Not a physical blow, a choice. The rule existed because, thousands of years ago, before the Thren had grown into the warrior culture the Concord knew today, the challenge combat had not been about strength at all. It had been about honesty, about forcing two people, in front of witnesses, to reveal something true about themselves that could not be hidden behind performance. Somewhere over the centuries, as fighting itself became easier to understand and honesty became harder, the tradition had calcified into something simpler, something everyone assumed was only about strength, because strength was easy to measure and honesty was not. Nobody who had ever challenged Caliph Vorthessa in 200 years, it seemed, had bothered to read past the summary. I sat there for a long time after that, the data pad glowing in the dark of my quarters, my heart beating faster than it had at any point since the gala. I was not going to win this fight with strength. I had known that from the beginning, and nothing in the last 2 days had changed it. But strength, I was beginning to understand, might never have been the actual question being asked. I did not sleep again that second night either. But this time, it was not fear keeping me awake. It was the beginning of a plan. On the morning of the second day, a message arrived at my quarters that I had not expected. It was not from Ambassador Brackwood, and it was not from the Concord Liaison Office. It was from Caliph Vorthessa herself, requesting a private meeting to explain the traditions of the challenge before the match, as courtesy demanded between opponents of unequal experience. Ambassador Brackwood was furious when she found out, convinced it was some kind of intimidation tactic designed to frighten me into withdrawing before the arena. I did not think that was the reason, though I understood why she assumed it. I agreed to the meeting anyway. Caliph arrived at the small conference room without any of her delegation, wearing simpler clothing than the ceremonial silver from the gala, something closer to what I imagined she might wear on an ordinary day at home, wherever home was for her. Without the crowd around her, without the performance, she looked different, tired maybe, or just tired of being watched. "You requested the original archive," she said, before I could speak. It was not a question. I did. "Nobody has requested the original archive in 80 years, she said. "The last time was a scholar from your own Concord's historical division, studying dead traditions for a museum exhibit, not a challenger." "I wanted to understand what I agreed to," I said, "not just the summary version." Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and careful, the same flicker I had seen at the gala. "And what did you find?" I decided in that moment not to lie to her. "I found that the summary leaves things out," I said. "Things that used to matter more than winning." She did not answer right away. She walked slowly to the window instead, looking out at the same slow-turning planet Sella and I had watched the day before, her hands folded behind her back in a posture that looked less like a warrior and more like someone carrying something heavy they were tired of holding alone. 200 years, she said, finally. "Do you know what that feels like, small one? 200 years of the same challenge, the same joke, the same result. I made the offer the first time because I believed it. I was young, foolish, certain that somewhere among the new species entering the Concord, someone would understand what was truly being asked. Instead, I found soldiers who wanted glory, or cowards who wanted to save face by refusing politely. Nobody asked what I was actually asking. "What were you actually asking?" I said. She turned back to face me, and for just a moment, the mask fell away entirely, and I saw something underneath it that looked almost fragile, which did not seem like the right word for a woman who had spent 2 centuries undefeated. "I was asking to be seen," she said quietly. "Not as a weapon, not as a legend, as someone worth understanding." The challenge became a joke, because everyone who answered it only ever wanted to prove something about themselves. Nobody ever tried to prove something about me. I let that sit in the space between us for a long moment before I answered. "I don't intend to fight you the way the others did," I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity sharpening into something more focused. "Then how do you intend to fight me?" "I'd rather show you in the arena," I said. "If I told you now, it wouldn't mean anything when it happened." For the first time since I had met her, Calith Vorthessa laughed, and it was nothing like the laugh at the gala. It was shorter, quieter, and it sounded almost like relief. "You are either the bravest human I have ever met," she said, "or the strangest, perhaps both." "I've been called worse," I said. She studied me a moment longer, then inclined her head, the closest thing to genuine respect I had seen from her yet. "One day remains," she said. "Use it well, Daniel Hartley." It was the first time she had used my name. She left without another word, and I stood alone in that quiet room for a long time afterward, turning over everything Sella had told me, everything the old archive had revealed, and everything Calith herself had just confirmed with her own voice. I had come looking for a loophole. What I had found instead was a woman who had been asking the same honest question for 2 centuries, buried under a tradition nobody bothered to fully understand anymore. I had 1 day left to build a plan around that truth. And for the first time since the gala, I felt something other than dread when I thought about the arena. I felt ready. The arena was carved from a material I did not recognize, smooth and pale, ringed with seating that climbed upward in tiers filled with representatives from every species in the Concord. By the time I arrived, every seat was full. Word had spread across the station and beyond it, out to ships in orbit and observation posts scattered through the system, until what should have been a private matter of tradition had become the single most watched event since the Concord induction ceremony itself. Ambassador Brackwood walked beside me through the corridor leading to the arena floor, her expression tight with worry she was trying very hard not to show. "Whatever happens in there," she said, "know that you have already done something no one else managed." You made her pause. "That alone matters. I don't intend to lose, Ambassador. I know you believe that. I only want you prepared for what happens if you're wrong." I did not answer, because I understood her fear, and because arguing would not have changed it. Instead, I walked forward, out through the arched entrance and onto the arena floor, into a wall of sound that hit me like a physical thing, 100 species all reacting at once to the sight of a single unarmed human standing in the center of that vast pale circle. Calith entered from the opposite side a moment later, and the sound of the crowd shifted, the way it always did for her. Anticipation, respect. In some corners of the arena, pity aimed at me. She wore the same silver ceremonial armor from the gala, though up close I could see it was lighter than it looked, built for speed rather than protection, the mark of a warrior who had never once needed to worry about being hit. She crossed the floor toward the center where I stood, and for the first time, I saw something in her posture that had not been there in any of the recordings I had studied, a kind of hesitation, small and carefully hidden, but real. An elder from her own species stood at the edge of the arena, an ancient, quiet figure wrapped in robes far plainer than the ceremonial silver worn by the rest of the delegation. This, I understood, was the neutral judge, the one whose word alone would determine what counted as decisive under rules that had not truly been tested in centuries. "You may still withdraw," Calith said, quietly enough that only I could hear it. "No one would think less of you for it. You have already done more than any challenger before you." "I'm not here to withdraw," I said. Something in her expression tightened, though whether it was worry or anticipation, I could not tell. The elder raised a hand, and the noise of the crowd fell away into silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. "The challenge begins," the elder said, in a voice that carried without needing to be raised. "Combat continues until a decisive result is achieved, as defined and witnessed under the old law." I noticed several members of the Concord audience exchange confused glances at the phrase "old law," a term the modern summary had quietly dropped from public use. I noticed Calith notice it too, her eyes flicking toward me with something sharper now, a question forming behind them that had not been there a moment before. The elder lowered his hand, and the match began. Calith did not rush me. I had expected her to end things quickly, the way she had against the Voss champion, but instead she circled slowly, watching, waiting, giving me space I had not expected. I understood, in that moment, that some part of her wanted to see what I would do before deciding how the match would end. I did not raise my hands the way a fighter would. I stood still instead, watching her circle, letting the silence stretch long enough that murmurs began rippling through the crowd, confusion spreading outward from the front rows. "Why do you not defend yourself?" Calith said, low enough that only I could hear. "Because I'm not fighting the fight everyone thinks I'm fighting," I said. She stopped circling. For a long moment, she simply studied me, warrior instincts clearly urging her to close the distance and end things the way she always had, and something else, something newer, holding her back. "Then what fight are you fighting?" she asked. "The one written before the summary," I said. "The one about honesty." Her breath caught, just slightly, just enough that I saw it. I took a slow step forward, closing some of the distance between us, my hands still open and empty at my sides. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, confusion turning toward tension, several members of the Thren delegation shifting uneasily in their seats. "The old law says the match ends the moment one of us makes a choice. The other cannot answer within the ritual," I said, quiet enough that it felt like the two of us were the only people in that enormous arena. "Not a blow, a choice." "You cannot know that," she said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. "I read the archive," I said, "the same one that was translated for you and your predecessors 2 centuries ago, before the modern summary replaced it in every diplomatic briefing since. Nobody who has challenged you in 200 years ever read past the summary, Calith, including, I think, most of your own people." The silence around us had become absolute. Even the elder, standing at the arena's edge, had gone very still, his ancient eyes fixed on the two of us with an intensity that suggested he, too, understood exactly what was happening. Calith's hands, which had been raised in a ready combat stance since the match began, slowly lowered to her sides. "What choice do you intend to make?" she asked, and for the first time in the entire match, her voice shook, just slightly, just enough that I heard the fear underneath 200 years of armor. "I'm not going to fight you," I said. "Not with strength. I never could have, and we both know it. So instead, I'm going to yield." A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd, gasps and murmurs rising from every tier of the arena at once. Ambassador Brackwood, seated near the front, rose halfway from her chair before catching herself, her face pale with alarm. "You cannot yield," Calith said quickly, something desperate entering her voice now. "Yielding is a defeat. It ends the match in my favor, under any interpretation, old law or new." "Not the way I intend to do it," I said. I turned, deliberately, away from her, toward the elder standing at the arena's edge, and I raised my voice loud enough to carry through the entire arena, loud enough for every species in every tier to hear clearly. "I yield," I said, "not because she has defeated me in strength, for she has not yet raised a hand against me, but because I choose, freely and without force, to lay down this fight in front of every witness here, so that the truth beneath this ritual can finally be spoken aloud instead of buried under 2 centuries of silence." The elder's eyes widened, the first visible reaction I had seen from him since the match began. "For 200 years," I continued, turning back to face Caliph directly, "warriors and champions and soldiers have answered your challenge with strength, because the modern summary told them strength was the only thing being tested. They fought to prove something about themselves. Not one of them, according to the old law carved into your own people's history, ever answered the actual question being asked. The question was never who is stronger. The question was always whether anyone would see you honestly enough to answer honestly in return." Caliph stood frozen, her armor catching the arena lights, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something raw, something that looked, to my eyes, almost like grief for 2 centuries she could not get back. "By the old law," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent arena, "a decisive result is not a blow that ends a fight. It is a choice that reveals a truth the other side cannot answer within the boundaries of the ritual. I have made mine. The truth I offer is this. You were never asking anyone to defeat you in combat, Caliph Vorthessa. You were asking someone to prove they understood what the challenge actually meant, and to answer it honestly, in front of everyone, instead of hiding behind a performance the way you have had to for 200 years. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder whether I had misjudged everything, whether the ancient rule I had found buried in a forgotten archive meant nothing at all in the modern arena, whether I had just embarrassed myself and my entire species in front of the whole Concord for nothing. Then the elder spoke, his ancient voice carrying clearly across the silent arena. "The old law recognizes the choice," he said. "A decisive result has been achieved." Gasps rippled outward through every tier of the arena at once, human and alien voices rising together in a wave of confusion and astonishment. Ambassador Brackwood sat frozen in her seat, her hand pressed to her mouth. Members of the Thren delegation exchanged stunned glances, several of them rising to their feet, voices raised in a mixture of protest and disbelief. Caliph Vorthessa stood in the center of the arena, staring at me, her armor gleaming under the arena lights, and for the first time in 200 years, in front of every species in the Concord, she did not know what to say. The uproar that followed lasted longer than the match itself. The elder had to raise both hands and repeat his ruling 3 times before the arena settled enough for anyone to be heard clearly. Members of the Thren delegation crowded around him, some demanding clarification, others simply staring at me as though seeing something they did not have a name for yet. I stood where I was, in the center of that vast pale arena, and I did not move, because I did not entirely trust my legs to carry me anywhere useful. Across from me, Caliph had not moved either. She stood very still, her hands loose at her sides, her armor no longer looking like the shell of an undefeated warrior, and more like something she was simply wearing, the way anyone wears clothing at the end of a long day. The elder finally raised his voice above the crowd, and something in his tone carried enough weight that even the loudest voices in the arena fell quiet to hear it. "The old law has not been invoked in 11 generations," he said. "Most among us have forgotten it existed at all, myself included, until this human's request for the original archive reached my office 3 days ago. I confirmed its authenticity myself, out of caution, expecting to find nothing more than a curiosity of history. Instead, I find its meaning proven true, here, before all of you." He turned toward Caliph, and his voice softened slightly, though it lost none of its authority. 200 years, warrior," he said. 200 years you have carried a challenge whose true purpose our own people forgot, and no one has answered it honestly until today. Not because he was the strongest to stand before you, because he was the first to actually listen to what you were asking. Caliph's composure, held together through 2 centuries of practiced performance, finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a small, quiet way that felt somehow larger than anything that had come before it. She lowered her head, one hand pressing briefly against her chest, and when she looked up again, her eyes were bright in a way I had not seen from her before. "I did not think anyone would ever find it," she said, her voice barely carrying across the distance between us. "I had begun to believe the old law was only a story scholars told each other. I had begun to believe I would spend the rest of my life performing the same empty ritual, until I no longer remembered why I started it." "Somebody had to read the whole book eventually," I said. "Seemed like it might as well be me." A ripple of something moved through the crowd at that. Not quite laughter, but close enough to it that some of the tension in the air finally began to loosen. Ambassador Brackwood, still seated near the front, had both hands pressed over her mouth now, her eyes wide, and I could not tell from her expression whether she was horrified or relieved, though I suspected, in that moment, it might have been both at once. The elder addressed the crowd once more, his voice carrying the weight of formal decree now. "Let it be recorded, across every archive of the Concord, that the challenge of Caliph Vorthessa has been answered, not through strength, but through the old law's true purpose. Let it further be recorded that the human delegation, in the person of Daniel Hartley, has demonstrated an understanding of Thren tradition deeper than that held by many among our own people. This is no small thing." The applause that followed started slowly, uncertain, spreading outward tier by tier as different species processed what they had just witnessed. By the time it reached the back rows, it had become something closer to a roar, hundreds of different sounds of approval from 100 different throats, blending into something that did not belong to any single species, but somehow belonged to all of them at once. I found Calith's eyes across the arena floor, and for the first time since the gala 3 days earlier, I saw her smile, not the sharp, performing smile she had worn that first night, but something smaller and far more real. She crossed the distance between us slowly, the crowd noise settling into a low hum around us, until she stood close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet her eyes. "You never intended to fight me at all," she said. "Not truly." "I intended to answer you," I said. "I just had to figure out what the question actually was first." 200 years, she said again, quieter this time, like she was still turning the number over in her own mind, trying to understand how it had finally ended. "I made that offer as a joke tonight. I have made it as a joke for longer than I can remember. I stopped believing it could ever be anything else." "Maybe it stopped being a joke the moment you stopped laughing," I said. She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face the way she had at the gala, except this time there was nothing sharp or testing in it. Just something open, something that looked, to my eyes, like relief finally allowed to surface after 2 centuries kept carefully buried. "Why did you not laugh that first night?" she asked. "Everyone else did. I expected it from you as well." I thought about Grace Whitfield, about my brother who filled every room without trying, about years spent in the back of every class picture, about a border conflict where quiet people fixed the damage, loud people left behind, without ever getting their names in a single report. "Because I've spent most of my life being underestimated by people who assumed loud things mattered more than quiet ones," I said. "And when I heard you make that offer, I didn't hear a joke. I heard someone who sounded tired of being right about how it would end before it even started. I know what that sounds like. I've heard it in my own voice before." Something in her expression shifted then, soft in a way I had not expected from a warrior undefeated for 200 years, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all, standing in the center of that arena while the crowd's noise rolled on around us like weather passing overhead. "The old law does not require marriage to follow from a decisive result," she said finally, a faint, careful smile touching the corner of her mouth. That part was always closer to legend than to law, even in the ancient text. "You should know that, in case it changes anything for you." "It doesn't," I said. "I wasn't answering you because of what came after. I was answering because somebody needed to." She studied me a moment longer, and then, for the first time since I had met her, she laughed again, but it was nothing at all like the laugh from the gala. It was warmer, quieter, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who has just remembered, after a very long time, what it feels like to be surprised by something good. Then perhaps, she said, we should discover together what comes next, without any old law telling either of us what it must be. In the days that followed, the story of the arena spread across the Concord faster than any diplomatic briefing could have managed on its own. Ambassador Brackwood, who had spent 3 days convinced I was about to destroy every hard-won relationship humanity had built in its first month among the stars, found herself instead fielding requests from a dozen different delegations, all wanting to know more about the strange, quiet species that had read an ancient rule nobody else had bothered to remember. Humanity's reputation shifted almost overnight, not toward the image of a strong species, which had never truly been in question, but toward something the Concord found far more interesting and, in some quarters, far more unsettling, a species that read the fine print, a species that listened for the real question underneath the one being asked out loud. A species, as one particularly dry-witted diplomat from the Marne delegation put it during a formal reception days later, that could not be trusted to lose gracefully because it had an irritating habit of finding the one exit nobody else had thought to look for. I did not become a general or a celebrated champion in the weeks that followed. I went back, mostly, to logistics work, coordinating supply routes and diplomatic schedules the same way I had before the gala, though now, with considerably more attention paid to whatever I happened to say in meetings. Grace Whitfield, when the story eventually reached her, sent me a short message that read simply, "Knew it," and nothing else, which felt about right. Calith and I met often after that, at first under the reasonable cover of continued diplomatic exchange between our two peoples, and later without needing any cover at all. She told me, eventually, about the years before the joke had calcified into performance, about a young warrior who had genuinely believed the old law still meant something, who had watched that belief worn down year after year by champions who only ever wanted to prove their own strength. I told her about Grace, about my brother, about years spent quietly fixing what loud decisions broke, about a border conflict that had taught me more about patience than any of my formal training ever had. We did not rush toward anything neither of us was ready for, but something had shifted between us in that arena, something that went beyond the old law, and beyond the joke it had replaced, and neither of us seemed particularly interested in pretending otherwise. Word of what happened that day continues to travel, even now, through Concord archives and diplomatic briefings across a dozen systems, usually summarized as the moment a quiet human logistics officer outmaneuvered an undefeated warrior through nothing more than careful reading and patient honesty. It is, I suppose, a fair enough summary, as far as summaries go. But summaries, I have learned, tend to leave out the parts that actually matter. What the summaries do not capture is the exact moment in that arena when 200 years of loneliness finally cracked open in front of 100 watching worlds, not because anyone struck a blow, but because, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, somebody finally stopped performing long enough to be honest. I did not defeat Calith Vorthessa that day. I am not sure, looking back, that defeating her was ever truly the point, no matter what the ancient text called it. What I did, if I am being honest, was simply refuse to laugh when everyone else did, and then spend 3 days making sure that refusal actually meant something once I arrived in that arena. It turned out that was enough. It turned out, in the end, that it was the only thing that ever could have been.